Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Yes, the title is Elves Made Me a Better Speaker. So who doesn't love a good story? Storytelling in a way is integral to being a good public speaker. Our club is an excellent venue to learn the craft of telling stories to entertain and educate others. My kids and I have a new family activity that requires me to use a lot of my Toastmasters storytelling skills. In fact, it uses some of the same muscle groups as public speaking at Toastmasters. Has anyone heard of Dungeons and Dragons? I'm sure some of you have, and maybe some of you are not very familiar with it. It's known as D&D for short. Let's see what it is and how it can help us. D&D is a fantasy role-playing game. To help explain that, I'm going to call on Brian. Are you familiar with the Lord of the Rings books and or movies?
I am familiar with them to the extent that, having been born in the late 60s, I remember the animated movie of The Hobbit.
The Hobbit.
But I have completely stayed free and clear of the Lord of the Rings books and movies.
Okay, but we know what's in the story. There's elves and dwarves and castles and battles with bad guys and good guys fighting on different sides.
Right.
That is the fantasy genre. So if you have ever seen if you have any knowledge or any familiarity with elves, castles, dwarves, battles of good and evil, that sort of thing, wizards, you're familiar with the genre of the fantasy part of that. Now, Phil, have you ever taken on a persona other than your own, maybe dressed up like a fictional character in order to become a different character?
Oh, yes.
I know that you have dressed up like Santa before. That is role playing. So fantasy role playing, that's all it is. You guys have a toehold now in the concept of fantasy role playing. The game part is pretty easy to grasp. Me and my kids sit down at the table and I help them to pretend they can fight made up monsters that are far stronger than they are if they work together. That's the game part. There are two parts to Dungeons and Dragons. There's the players and there's the dungeon master or the DM. The dungeon master created a framework. He has a story that he wants to tell. He's got a framework that the players are going to go through, hopefully, in order to get to the end of the story that the dungeon master or DM is trying to tell them. The story's usually pretty well defined, but you can't have it very rigid because the players have free will. Their characters can do lots of different things. They're not locked into just doing X, Y, or Z. They just can make up things and say, I'm going to go run over here and do this, which has nothing to do with the story that the DM is trying to tell. So in our games, I do the DMing and my kids are the players. So there's rules, procedures really in Dungeons and Dragons, but the actions are kind of open-ended. So when they have an encounter, they can decide what to do. If a monster comes up, there's an ogre in front of my kids playing these characters. So that's where the dice rolling comes in. You guys probably heard about the dice part of Dungeons and Dragons. You come up against an ogre, you want to hit it with your sword. Okay, roll this dice to see if you can hit it. Oh, good, you rolled a high enough number. Now roll these dice to see how bad you hurt it. It's not super complicated, but there are some rules. The tricky part is they have free will. So how do I, as a storyteller, guide them along the story I'm trying to get them to the end of? They have free will. I want them to take a certain path so that they can get to the treasure, but they don't know that. So when I DM with my kids, I find myself using a lot of my own Toastmaster skills to try and keep them engaged and entertained and invested in the story that I'm wanting to tell them. Now, D&D was created a long time ago, and it immediately gathered a vivacious and loyal fan base, but it wasn't for everyone. There was a certain nerd stigma attached to it. In those days, D&D was for losers who probably loved computers too. But there are a lot of indicators that it has crossed over into pop culture. There are many celebrities that play Dungeons and Dragons or are not ashamed of it. It's estimated there are 17 million players of Dungeons and Dragons right now in the world. That's a lot of nerds, wouldn't you say? So there are a lot of reasons that it's ready to be embraced even by Toastmasters. You have to work together to achieve common goals. That requires teamwork and collaboration skills. And the leadership path that I'm currently on those qualities figure heavily. Understanding that our thoughts, beliefs, and desires are different than other people's is a core aspect to playing D&D as well as being a public speaker. The explicit goal of this exact speech was indicated to be presenting something unfamiliar and bringing people in a group together into what you're trying to, this unfamiliar topic. So, Mr. Toastmaster, Elves have helped me become a better speaker, and they can do it for you too. Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster.